I'm going to reflect a bit here on how creative systems theory came to be. I do so in part to help clarify its contribution, both its ability to uh, put the particular times we live in perspective, also its ability to clarify the new kinds of thinking we need for going ahead. Um, Also, really, in that to put creative systems theory and the kinds of assumptions and perspective it brings in the context of the larger history story of ideas. Um, I do it also for another kind of reason as well, and that is to clarify a kind of confusion that can happen when people first encounter creative systems theory ideas, particularly in academic environments. Uh, I can have people ask, well, what are the origins of creative systems theory? You know, what are the intellectual roots? Whose ideas have I drawn on to create creative systems theory? And there's an important sense in which creative systems theory is kind of whole cloth original conception, and that doesn't mean it's created from nothing, but it's not created quite from the kind of origins that one might assume it came from. So I'm going to be taking a little bit of time just to clarify how it did come into being, which is just an interesting story in and of itself, and also use that telling to help put creative systems theory in a broader perspective. Creative systems theory had its start in fascination early in my life with creative process. I grew up in a very interesting environment in which my earliest manifestation was as a sculptor and as a musician. It was in the creative arts. I had a lot of science around me as well, but there was a major fascination there in creative process and just how it worked. Um, One of the things that really struck me with that, and which is really quite obvious if you think about it, is that if you're going to engage creative process and understand it, it really requires that one recognize, embrace, engage the whole notion of multiple intelligences. Creative process is not just about rationality. It's about engaging our imagination. It's about engaging our emotions. It's about engaging even deeper into the intelligence of the body, the rich underworld of experience. That was clearly all the case, and that was absolutely fascinating to me. And in that, I studied with people to help sort of understand those other intelligences. I studied with Joseph Campbell early before he was recognized in his thinking very much, and in order to understand more about the mythic and imaginal aspects of intelligence. I studied with some of the early innovators in more body intelligence aspects of psychology. All of that was very, very fascinating with me. As I set aside being a sculptor and looked farther into, I wanted to look more deeply into creative process, began to lead workshops on creative process and how it worked. I thought I could look to psychology writings to learn a lot more about it. As it turns out, given this more positivist bent of psychological theory, there wasn't a whole lot there to be found, and I realized I was going to have to dive in myself a lot there. But the early observations were not terribly sophisticated or terribly original. They really had to do with the fact that you could recognize general rough stages in how any formative process, any creative process worked. Things started in a more incubation germinal stage, then there was more of an aha inspiration stage, then there was more of a perspiration stage after the inspiration stage, and finally a more finishing polishing stage, and then there are actually other stages after that in which whatever one has created becomes more second nature and part of just accepted understanding, perspective in oneself and the world and all of that. That's not terribly original, but that was where I began. A really very important original insight comes back to that piece of multiple intelligences. And I'm going to keep coming back here because it's really in that we'll understand a lot of what's new, and we'll understand a lot about creative systems theory's place in the larger history of ideas. The first thing I saw was that, guess what? Different intelligence or different combinations of intelligence come to fore at different stages in creative process and formative process. Creative processes begin really in primarily body intelligence. All the intelligences are involved, but it's primarily body intelligence. It begins in that incubation, sort of dark underworld, womb world kind of place, and it's in those first inklings that creative process gets born. And then next you have the ahas, the insights, the first buddings, and their imaginal intelligence comes more to the fore. It's imagery, it's first insights, it's that more mythic dream kind of part begins to give form to creative process. Then it's more into that perspiration stage. You have to let beyond insight, and you struggle into the manifestation to form, which is a much more emotion-based kind of aspect of formative process. Then finally, when you get a more full establishment of form, what begins to happen after that? Well, then there's a more finishing and polishing stages, and the rational intelligence becomes more, as the intelligences deal, that's concerned more with polish and refinement and surface, and all of that is our more rational intelligence, and that comes in that creative stage. So those are important awarenesses, and tying intelligences that closely with creative process was fairly original. The next piece took me by surprise. I wasn't looking there at all. One thing that happened in my study of doing classes on creative process is that I saw a lot with that. I was doing that creative process was life process, and I was being a psychotherapist and a fairly innovative one, and I probably should learn a little bit more about what that was what was going on and what other people had written about it, and that's where I began studies as a psychiatrist, and I had a particular fascination in developmental psychology, Piaget, people like that, who were sort of looking at how human understanding organizes itself, and human process and development organizes itself over time. Well, the aha that came to me, and I'm not sure why it hasn't been articulated more clearly before, was that it appeared that developmental process in individual human development followed those same essential stages, and of critical importance, those same intelligences holding the primary organizing force at those different stages. All of this is stuff I've written about in much more detail in other sources. I'm just sort of flying through it here, but to create that larger perspective. But but in our infancy, what's our primary, and in the first months and years of life, what's our primary intelligence? It's body intelligence. It's a taste and touch and movement. It's Piaget's sensory motor intelligence. That's where we start. And then what happens in childhood? Well, we move more into imaginal intelligence. It's the intelligence of let's pretend and make believe and all of that kind of stuff that makes childhood so wonderful and magical. And then in adolescence, we set a lot of those childish ways aside, and it's really emotional intelligence that moves much more to the fore in adolescence. And our emotional ardencies, our sense of cliques and fads, and how we relate to all of that stuff becomes, as we begin to move into finding ourselves as specific people, we're finding ourselves outside family and beginning to connect emotionally with the world around us. Emotional intelligence, emotional moral intelligence becomes much more to the fore. Then as we move into adulthood, like we begin to grow up in how we think, we become more individuals, we become more rational, and rational intelligence comes to define much more of how we think about understanding as we move into being young adults and into the main maturity in adulthood. Okay, well, that was interesting, and reflected on that. The next kind of ha was even more startling and took me more out of my world of a familiar experience for me. And that is, as I learned more about history, more about just the rise of civilization, how the human story in a larger sense, I began to notice, I began to recognize, particularly learning about myth, when myth was primary in culture, learning about more tribal societies. It became clear that, guess what, we could see that same kind of patterning really ordering the larger human story. So if you are in, and again, looking at it through the lens of multiple intelligence is a way to really grasp the depth of the parallels that I'm talking about. So, you know, a tribal society, in tribal society, you know, all intelligences are there, but it's really body intelligence that defines the bottom line, that is primarily defining. So, you know, if you live in a tribal society, you know, everybody knows the dances, knows the songs. If you don't, it's tantamount to not being part of the tribe, which is not being part of existence. Truth is one's embeddedness in the body of nature. When you begin to move out of tribal societies into the early civilizations, it begins to become mythic. Imaginal intelligence moves much more to the fore. You've got pantheons of gods. You've got the great mythic tales being told. After that time of imaginal intelligence being primary, begin to move into what we find with the beginnings of the European Middle Ages and rise of monotheism. It becomes a much more morally defined reality, one much more of strong emotional ardencies that define the experience. Then as we move into what emerges with the Renaissance, increasingly rational intelligence comes to the fore, where we move into literally an age of reason, an age of science, in which the other intelligences become relegated to a separate world of the subjective, and it's our capacity for reason and logical processes which becomes not just a bottom line for truth, it becomes what we perceive to be, in fact, the final and ideal nature of truth. So what a fascinating story. And it was in this perception of those parallels that much of my early thinking in the development of creative systems theory came, as I just began to put those pieces together, articulate it, find absolute fascination in it, and realize I was moving in some fairly new territory here where I wasn't finding a lot of parallels in other writing. Those are the kinds of concepts that creative systems theory calls patterning in time, okay, developmental kinds of notions. There's a whole other piece in creative systems theory which is really, you know, of equal significance in its own way, which I call patterning in space, which, you know, is sort of here and now systemic relationships, and the fact that how they organize, and also the fact that they had a relationship to what we find with the patterning in time notions, again, took me totally by surprise, and happened in a very different kind of context. When I was in college, I had the wonderful experience of being able to take classes in world music and ethnomusicology, and what a profound experience. This is when some of that kind of classes are some of the first in the country that were happening, and that was not something that was a part of most people's experience. So we'd go into class every day and hear music that we'd never heard before, that wasn't just being invented, but had been around for thousands of years, just in other parts of the world. Mind-blowing. Well, that in itself was fascinating, but me with my kind of psychological eye noticed something else in the room that other people didn't notice, but it was fascinating. And that is, music would get played from a particular time and place and culture that we never heard before, and you look around the room, and some people were just, I mean, they were enthralled. It was like they were listening to this music they hadn't heard before, and it was like, come home to mama. It was just very special and almost sacred to them. And at the same time, to the same music, you look at other people in the room, and they were reacting like it was fingernails on a blackboard. It was awful for them. How fascinating. And so I was going, well, now what this has to do with this is music from other places in the world. How should this affect people? And then, next week music would get played from a whole different place, and it would be a different group of people that would come home to mama, and a different group of people for whom it was fingers on a blackboard. Okay, out of that observing, I began to put together some of the temperament notions within creative systems theory of recognizing, guess what? People with different kinds of personality styles are going to relate to music from different periods of culture in different ways. Notice an observation that I don't think is there in any other framework for understanding temperament differences, in which we see a link between developmental notions, patterning in time, and here and now systemic relationships, the more patterning in space stuff that becomes part of the temperament stuff within creative systems theory. The other major piece of creative systems theory also began to move into my understanding at this time, and that's what the more whole systems patterning concepts, which I write about in detail in other places, but the concept of aliveness or referent in a whole system sense, notions of capacitance, how much life one can hold at one time. And I realized that if I was going to use these patterning in time and patterning in space concepts in any way to perceive with detail, I was also going to need to have these more whole systems patterning concepts there to as tools as well. So in that was those pieces created what was the origins and the early thinking of creative systems theory. Notice it's plenty of other thinkers I had contact with, but it wasn't like the ideas were built on the insights of other thinkers for the most part, in terms of the relationships between things, which were the key observations. Out of all that, colleagues challenged me to a couple things. One is several key colleagues pointed out that really what I was developing was a kind of systems theory and a quite sophisticated kind of systems theory, and so that I should learn more about that. And it was also at this point that I actually started formally calling what I was putting together creative systems theory. Also, they encouraged me to write, and that was the origins of the 7-year process that resulted in the book, The Creative Imperative. Out of all this, too, came an essential recognition which has really defined an awful lot of the major focus of my life since that time. And that was implied in all of this, but it's not where I'd given my primary attention. And that was the recognition that these ideas not only helped me understand the past and sort of how human cognitive process and creative process worked better, they gave a way to understand the present. They gave a way to understand the tasks of our time, what we are about in the time that we are in culture. If we were talking that we're indeed at a time that's demanding of us a kind of new maturity as a species, these ideas were giving me a way to understand what that meant, to understand a way to articulate a new defining narrative for our time, and to be able to talk in terms of the particular developmental capacities that was going to be about. That at first that wasn't as interesting to me as a lot of the other more developmental notions, and I realized in time, in fact, that there's a huge responsibility conferred by that recognition. And we live at a time where we easily have a crisis of purpose, where we're easily wandering aimlessly. So to have ideas that could begin to give some direction and give us direction in terms of developing the kinds of new leadership skills we need for the future, that was really important. So it's at that point that I started the Institute for Creative Development as a place for doing think tank work, for doing leadership training work, and to further develop these notions. And that was 15 years of work. Very important time, very rich time. It was also the case at the end of that 15 years I began to recognize that we'd worked in a pretty private, enclosed kind of environment of pretty exceptional people doing deep work over time, and that somehow I needed to find ways to articulate at least the concept of cultural maturity, but also some of these other patterning notions where they're useful as tools for a broader audience. And that's been my work over the last 10 years. I started by taking some time and saying, are these notions as important as I think they are? And by really reflecting a lot in terms of the best of thinking in the world that I could find, I really realized that in terms of those two tasks, articulating a narrative for our time and helping us understand the kinds of new thinking we need going forward, that they made huge contributions. In the last 10 years of my life has been involved in writing, attempting to articulate for a somewhat broader audience. And that's what my three more recent new books are about. And now I'm at the interesting place of saying, okay, those new books are coming out. How can I best, don my cultural psychiatrist cap and provide some larger voice in the world in terms of cultural mature perspective and just the whole notion of the kind of growing up our time needs to be about. So let's turn to that question of the place of creative systems theory and cultural mature perspective in general within the larger history of ideas. Key in all of this is the recognition that when we're dealing with cultural mature perspective, we're not just dealing with new ideas. We're dealing with a new kind of thinking. We're really dealing with fundamental underlying cognitive changes. And what's happening with those cognitive changes is a key part of it. We can come back to that piece of multiple intelligences. They're becoming able, with the more integrative stages of formative process within culture as a developmental process, to be able to be conscious of it and hold the larger whole of our complexity. I often use the metaphor of like being able to hold the whole box of crayons of who we are as human beings. In terms of intelligence, I talk about integrated meta-perspective, the ability to hold the full complexity, particularly the full complexity of all our multiple intelligences. Well, put in the history of ideas is like recognize what our relationship to intelligence was at the previous stage in the evolution of culture during the Age of Reason. Over the last 300 years, of the age of the individual, the Age of Reason, it was our primary intelligence was rationality. We made that truth itself. It's like our task in the Enlightenment was to bring the whole of understanding into the light of reason. Well, what happens to do that? What do you get? You get the kind of worldview that we had over the last 300 years in which, Descartes says, the world is essentially a great machine. Well, that's exactly what the world looks like if you look at primarily through rational intelligences. Great, amazing advances came out of that. Incredible. As we move forward, however, if you look at the capacities needed to address any of the important questions of our time, they require what creative systems theory calls integrated meta-perspective. We have to be able to see the world more through the whole of ourselves, through the whole of the intelligences that we have to bring to bear to understand. If we're going to understand life in living terms, not just in mechanistic terms, and if particularly we're going to understand the very particular kind of creative, meaning-making, tool-making life that we are as human beings, we have to be able to bring that much more dynamic, that much more systemic kind of complexity to bear, which is only possible with integrated meta-perspective. So there we can understand culturally mature capacity as an important next chapter in the evolution of story of human understanding. The concept of cultural maturity points toward how that more dynamic and systemic, being able to hold our full complexity kind of understanding will be essential to addressing any of the essential questions ahead. Important to do that there's nothing esoteric in that. I mean, really not even that complicated in its own way. I emphasize over and over again when I'm teaching about culturally mature capacities, this isn't some new spiritual enlightenment, or this isn't some new great intellectual achievement. What we're talking about is really very much common sense. All those new capacities are common sense. it's just a level and sophistication of common sense that as a species we've not been capable of before. But you know, if we engage the essential developmental tasks of our time, that's where we're taken to. And so once again, you know, that as I see it, and why it is worth taking the time to engage the concept of cultural maturity, it's engage, and worth engaging much more specific tools, like some of the tools creative systems theory puts forward to make our way, maneuver in that territory. All of that's essential, just because it gives us the kinds of tools we need to move effectively forward as a human species.